You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Okay, so the Trump team has officially rested its case this morning, but not after their own witness managed to have a pretty devastating testimony. So we're going to dive into that. But first, just a reminder for those watching, if you want to follow along as this trial winds down now, please make sure to subscribe to both of our channels. Okay, so Glenn, the Trump team's only witness, Robert Costello, had just finished testifying. Yesterday, he was admonished by the judge pretty severely. He didn't seem to do himself many favors today either. So talk about what happened in court.
Yeah, Brian, I can't overstate just how bad Bob Costello's testimony was for the Trump defense. Let's start out down in the weeds and then let's pull back to 30,000 feet, because what I think the prosecutors proved on cross-examination of defense witness Bob Costello is that Costello, together with Giuliani and Donald Trump, tried to catch and kill Michael Cohen's damaging testimony. Not talking about killing him literally, but figuratively, they tried to catch and kill the testimony, the damaging evidence that Michael Cohen could have provided against Donald Trump in the event he flipped. And obviously they failed, and they failed miserably. But so here is the setup. So Robert Costello, who was a Giuliani loyalist and a Trump loyalist, desperately wanted to represent as a lawyer Michael Cohen when it looked like Cohen was going to get in trouble. And obviously there was going to be a risk to Donald Trump, because if Cohen flipped, Trump was in deep trouble, as we have now seen. That's come home to roost. So Costello was reaching out to Michael Cohen saying, listen, I'll represent you. You have friends in high places. You can sleep well tonight. In other words, I'll represent you. I'm part of the, Giuliani, Trump cabal. Trump will have your back, and it will all be good. But the message, Brian, was unmistakable. Don't flip on Trump. Let me read you two short emails that the prosecution introduced into evidence during cross-examination of Costello. These are devastating. First of all, in June of 2018, June 22nd, here is what Costello writes to some of his law partners about his efforts to try to represent, to grab hold of, to catch and kill the story of Michael Cohen. He says, Cohen has to know this, yet he continues to slow play us and the president. Is he totally nuts? What should I say to this asshole? He is playing with the most powerful man on the planet. This is mind-blowing. Costello is undertaking to represent Michael Cohen. That would be the person whose interests he should zealously represent. And he is saying to his, associates, man, Michael Cohen is playing us meaning me and the president. What should I tell this asshole? Wait a minute. That's the asshole whose legal interests you are supposed to represent zealously, including Bob Costello, facilitating Michael Cohen to cut a deal and flip on Trump if it would be in Michael Cohen's best interests to do so. And here's a follow-up email, this one between Cohen and Costello, because Costello was relentlessly trying to grab hold of Michael Cohen and represent him. And let me tell you, Brian, that's ordinarily not the way it works. Usually, it's the client who is seeking out counsel of the attorney, not the attorney hounding the client to, come into the fold and let me represent you. Here's what Michael Cohen says on August 8th, 2018. Please cease contacting me, as you do not and have never represented me in this or any other matter. Brian, the signal that the jury got was unmistakable. There was a danger to Donald Trump. And the way Trump and Costello and others addressed that danger is by trying to neutralize it, by trying to grab hold of it, by trying to shut it down, by trying to catch it and kill it. The parallels between what Costello and Trump and company tried to do to Michael Cohen and what they did to Karen McDougal and Stormy Daniels and others are unmistakable. And the only reason, I'm convinced, the only reason the defense put Bob Costello on the stand is because Donald Trump said he's a pit bull. I'm telling you to put him on the stand. It is a strategic blunder for the ages.
Yeah, I mean, all he did was basically prove the exact theory that Donald Trump himself is trying to push back against. But Glenn, I mean, knowing how damaged he was, why wouldn't Trump's attorneys push back against this? I mean, knowing the emails that existed, knowing the ways in which Costello's testimony and all of the evidence that exists regarding Costello would kind of undermine Donald Trump's own case. Why would the attorneys allow for this? I mean, or is the answer just that their client is just leading them and they have really no say in the matter?
It's because they are weak individuals and poor lawyers. You know, lawyers are the ones who get to make the strategic decisions when they're representing a client. It's not the client who gets to dictate what witnesses will or will not be called at trial. It's the lawyer's strategic decisions to make. You know, it's interesting because defendants actually have relatively few rights in the criminal justice process that they alone hold. What are those rights? The right to plead guilty or not guilty, the right to invoke a jury trial or waive your right to a jury trial, the right to testify or decline to testify. That's embodied in the Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination. Otherwise, the defense attorneys are the ones who make the strategic and tactical calls. But if you're so weak that you're afraid of your client, you can't stand up to his bullying, then you end up making really poor tactical and strategic choices because it's the client who is dictating them. But where have we seen this movie before? People falling in line and kowtowing to Donald Trump and his bullying? Oh, I don't know, maybe the entire Republican Party. So, you know, this is not really news. But let's now pull back to the 30,000-foot view and look at how much damage has been done to Trump's defense. All experienced criminal litigators know that it's better to put on no defense than to put on a really weak defense. Or worse, a defense that's going to incriminate your client and actually corroborate the prosecution's star witness, as the Trump team just did. But here's why it's better to put on no defense. Because if once the prosecution says, Your Honor, the government rests, which means we have presented all of the witnesses and introduced all of the evidence that we're going to introduce in this case, then they turn to the defense. Defense, do you have any evidence to present? Your Honor, the defense rests. We have no witnesses to call. Now, there may be a gasp in the courtroom, like, oh my goodness, they have nothing? They have no one who will come in and exonerate Donald Trump, the defendant? But here is how the defense spins that in closing arguments.
I feel like I've sat through enough legal breakdowns that I can almost guess if that's okay.
If you want to give it a shot, because you have been one heck of a law school student.
I would guess that they would say that they didn't meet the high bar, the beyond a reasonable doubt threshold that they had to meet in order to secure a conviction, and so they didn't even need to bring themselves down to the level of showing defendants because the government just failed to meet its burden in this case.
And you just got an A in Criminal Law 101. Yeah, so exactly. And I've heard this over and over again in my 30 years of prosecuting cases, because more often than not, the defense calls few witnesses or no witnesses at all. And then they stand up, they say, ladies and gentlemen, you know, you may have been surprised, you may have raised an eyebrow when we said we rest, we're not calling any witnesses, but you already know why. Because the prosecution so miserably and plainly and transparently failed to prove our client's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt on these Mickey Mouse charges they opted to indict him on. They have to live with that decision, that we didn't need to call any witnesses because the proof was so lacking. So now we're going to ask you to go back into the deliberation and do what you know is right based on this failed prosecution and find our client not guilty. I mean, I've heard some variation of that hundreds of times in courtrooms, military and civilian, federal and local, and that would have been the far wiser strategic choice by Donald Trump's defense team than putting up Bob Costello, who blew up Donald Trump's defense and corroborated Michael Cohen.
Well, another big piece of news from today was that Donald Trump himself, not so surprisingly, opted not to testify. What did you make of that?
Not surprising. I think everyone suspected Donald Trump would not testify. He couldn't withstand 10 seconds of cross-examination by the New York prosecutors, who have done one heck of a job presenting this case. So here's the other thing, and the reason I mentioned a few minutes ago, because I knew we were going to discuss this, the decision whether to testify or not is exclusively, solely the defendant's decision. So the defendant cannot say, well, my defense attorney said I can't testify. BS. His defense attorneys probably advised him against testifying. But, pretty much every jurisdiction in the country, it is a requirement that the judge specifically asks the defendant before he goes final on a decision whether to testify or not. The judge will say, you understand this is your decision and your decision alone to make, whether to testify or not. It's not a decision that can be made by your attorneys. You should consult with them. They can advise you, but it is your decision whether to testify or waive your absolute right to testify. What do you choose to do, Defendant Trump? And Trump, not surprisingly, punked out and said, I'm not going to testify in my own defense. Now, a jury can never hold that against the defendant because we all enjoy a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, which means we can't be compelled to testify in our own defense at trial. But it is pretty telling that not only does Donald Trump have no witnesses who will exonerate him on the evidence, but even he can't take the witness stand and testify in his own defense.
Yeah, well said. So, Glenn, let's talk about the schedule now. Both sides have rested their case, so now we're getting into closing arguments. Can you talk about when that's going to happen and when we're likely to see the jury finally get into deliberation?
Yeah, so Judge Merchan announced today that the jury would return on Tuesday, 1 week from now, and then they will have closing arguments. Closing arguments will probably take a full day, maybe a day and a half, because the prosecution gets a rebuttal argument after the defense closing argument. So I suspect it will be in the hands of the jury by maybe Wednesday or Thursday of next week. And then they could decide it in an hour, a day, a week, or a month. But I would expect they'll take a few days to pour through the evidence they've heard, and then we'll probably see verdicts as early as, Monday or Tuesday of the following week.
Okay, and then once we see verdicts, then what happens from there? Let's say they hand down a guilty verdict. When do we see sentencing?
Great question. So I consulted with some of my friends who are criminal litigators in New York, and unlike many other jurisdictions, the federal jurisdiction, for example, where we usually hold sentencing hearings about 60 to 90 days after the jury verdict is entered, in New York, they typically set sentencing hearings for about a week after the verdict is delivered. Now, I have a feeling in this case they may push that time out, particularly because there is a very real possibility in the event of conviction, Donald Trump will be sentenced to prison. So the authorities who have already, we have heard some reporting, have been discussing how they would safely confine, incarcerate a former president of the United States. They've already been sort of strategizing on that front. They're going to need some time to probably put, those plans in place. So it could be, that they will extend the usual 1 week time frame between verdict and sentencing, push it out to several weeks. But, all of this is uncharted territory. We don't really know. But it looks like some of these questions will be answered soon enough, particularly in the event the jury convicts Donald Trump on his crimes.
And of course, for those watching right now, if you want to follow along with all of this unprecedented news right now, Glenn and I will continue to do daily comprehensive coverage of all of it. So please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.